read out any. If we do ask questions, we won't read out any names or anything. So feel free to ask things. Don't worry that your name's going to be read out and published on YouTube, because it won't. And all we'll see on the recording is Helen and the slides. So I'll hand over to you, Helen. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am, as Michelle has said, Helen Lawson from Wellbeing Training Solutions. If you do want to get in touch in any way, then there is a QR code on the screen. You are welcome to contact me there, or just look me up on LinkedIn and we can connect that way. Just to warn you, you might hear some binging and bonging as we go through the session, because as people join and leave, sometimes we do hear that in the background. It doesn't show up on the recording, but we do hear it sometimes in the day-to-day sessions. This is the third session that I've done recently for Medway Healthy Workplaces. The last two were on day-to-day anxieties and managing an unruly mind. So if you're interested in those or any of the other topics that Medway Healthy Workplaces have laid on, do just Google Medway Healthy Workplaces on YouTube and those previous sessions will be available for you. And now I want to beg you, plead with you. If you've been to my other sessions, there are a few things that remain constant. And one of them is, I say to you, you've decided to be here, so be here. Please be here. If you thought that a session entitled Work-Life Balance and Managing Boundaries, Healthy Boundaries, was important to you, there would be an irony about you answering emails while you're on the session. So do think about why you're here, because it will be hard to get the very best out of it. Because this is a really mixed group, we've got people from all different organisations who may or may not know each other. At no point will I ask you to interact with each other. I'm going to do sort of an hour of input effectively. And from that input, what I want you to get is stuff that you can go away and reflect on. So there will be moments where I'll ask you to reflect, but I won't be asking you to give answers to a mixed group that you're not familiar with. I want you to be comfortable, but to get what you need from the session. So we will take questions at the end, so jot them down if anything comes to mind, or if you're like me, they'll fall straight out of your head if you don't get to ask them straight away. And I will also make copies of the presentation available to Michelle, and she can pass them on to you if you're interested, so you don't feel you have to write absolutely everything down. But as you go through, what would be brilliant is if you kind of have that question in your mind, why am I here? And then what you're seeing is relevant to you, and jot those things down so you know these are the things you need to come back to and think about a little bit more. And this is the sort of topic that could be really heavily laden with legislation and statistics and all those things. But all I want to deliver for you in the short amount of time that we've got is, what should a healthy work-life balance look like? How do you achieve it? What does it definitely not look like? And some of you might be a bit disappointed to know that the answers are probably a bit more closer to home than you might imagine. But I promise that there is no element of that which is me finger wagging saying you need to do better. But there is a reality about us choosing whether we are going to change the way we look at and deal with the world, which is much easier to do than expecting the world to change for us. So with all of that said, let's move on then. And what is work-life balance? What does that mean to you? So this is your first piece of reflection. Just going to give you 30 seconds now to think about, what would work-life balance look like to you? Not ideal world stuff, not perfect, unrealistic stuff, but just, I would be happy with that. Take a moment. And having had a moment or two to think about what work-life balance would look like, I want you to start to make this really personal. This is about you. What matters to you and works for you is not what matters for somebody else and works for them. For some people, work-life balance would be not having to work at all. For some people, work-life balance is being able to devote more time to their work. We sometimes kid ourselves that actually, not working would be the holy grail. But many of us don't appreciate how much of our identity, our meaning, our purpose, our status is wrapped up in our work. And when we get really, really busy, the desire is to pull away completely because it feels like the only possible solution. But there's always a middle ground that can be found. And that's what I'm going to try and help you to find a way towards this afternoon. And it's a really odd statement, isn't it? Work-life balance. Like, you've got work and then you've got life. Well, I mean, that's not really a great balance, is it? Because we know work takes up a huge chunk of normally 5 days of our week, but life is loads of things. Life is parents, children, relationships, friends, leisure pursuits, passions, spirituality, physical activity. So it's not like we've got this one activity versus this one activity. We've got this one activity versus 30 activities very often. And that is a really tough balance to strike. And sometimes we forget that we are entitled to more and we can strive for more than we get at the moment. So let's look at a definition of what work-life balance might look like. And there are loads of them. Google it and you will find so many, but I think this one kind of sums it up for me. Healthy work-life balance refers to maintaining a harmonious relationship between your work and personal life. It involves consciously managing your time and your energy to meet your professional and personal commitments while prioritizing self-care and well-being. Now, once again, I'm going to ask you to reflect. That's a big statement. That's a big ask. On a scale of 0 to 10, and again, you're not going to have to share this. I want you to use this time to reflect just for yourself. On a scale of 0 to 10, which is actually, I have none of that in my life whatsoever at the moment, and 10 being, yeah, I'm on it. I've got all of those things. I've got exactly what I need in my life. What number would you give yourself? And give yourself a number. Be clear, be definitive. It's quick and dirty. You're not going to get much time to reflect, but give yourself that number. And then that tells you how much work you really need to do to try and move to a different place and a different space for yourself. So what does a work-life balance look like? Well, I'm sure we'd all love to be that lady perched on a little rope and everything very evenly balanced. I don't know whether I'd break 1 or 2 hips if I were to give it a go, but I'm not going to try. But work-life balance looks like this. It looks like, first of all, you need to know your rights, because if you've walked into, I think this is particularly important for young people coming into a work environment now, or people who've worked in the same organisation for a long time. You walk into a culture and you think that culture is what you should expect. And maybe it isn't. Maybe that is not what your rights entitle you to. Maybe it's not what you should be expecting to deal with. But I think, I'm conscious that I also work with employers all the time. And on their behalf, I would want to say, think also about your responsibilities, because it has to be a two-way street. If your employer plays ball with you and they give you time when you need it and they're kind and considerate and they don't look over your shoulder, then are you fulfilling your responsibilities in return to them? And my guess is, for most people who are coming on a course about work-life balance, they're probably doing their bit, otherwise they wouldn't be here. But be aware that you may have rights that you don't know about, and there will be some resources at the end, some contacts that you might want to look at if you think that that is not the case. Your time management. Now, I can't go into time management too much today. That is a whole other course. But there are so many different time management strategies. Different ones work for different people. Generally speaking, to-do lists are not considered to be terribly effective, because we tend to pick off the quick and the easy and leave the hard and the long, because psychologically we're built to want the gratification of ticking something off and ticking it off quickly. But there are strategies within time management that you can use to avoid falling into that pitfall. And also, are your prioritization skills good? Are you good at being able to notice what is important and what isn't? And there is a way of doing that where you can identify whether things maybe can afford to just be dropped off the list. If you're a perfectionist, and I would say often people who attend these sessions have those tendencies because they want to do everything exactly right, you might find that the prioritization bit is a real problem for you, because the idea of not doing something becomes extremely difficult. Do you have good boundaries? For me, I think this is where most people are falling down, that their boundaries aren't clear, and that somewhere along the line, they got convinced that they should be doing more than they are doing. Certainly COVID, the pandemic, working from home, people afraid to go for a wee because the boss might ring when they're not available at that moment in time. That kind of tension was raised in people. And are you really clear about the distinction between your work and your life activities? Myself and Michelle were having a conversation just before you all arrived about different technologies that we use. And I expressed a personal loathing for WhatsApp being used for business purposes. Because if your phone is not a work phone that you can turn off at the end of the day, that's hugely intrusive. That takes over, it stops your ability to ever switch off. So are you clear about those distinctions? Have you got stress management outlets? If that stress management outlet is a bottle of wine, that's probably not very helpful. Might be very nice, but not very helpful. But, things like physical activity, yoga, meditation, mindfulness, or even just spending time with family and friends. Have you got those things in place to help you recover from the stresses and strains of work? And also flexibility. And that is, in this instance, flexibility from your employer. Is your employer giving you the flexibility you need for medical appointments, to care for relatives, to take time when you need time, to take your annual leave? Or are there times where they say, no, you definitely can't have annual leave for maybe that 2-month block? And that's a time in which you're extremely busy. And this ties right back to the first bullet point about knowing your rights. So work-life balance looks like having all of these things. You know your rights and responsibilities. You're good at time management. You've got good boundaries, good stress outlets, and you also have flexibility. It would be really easy to say, well, the opposite of that is a lack of balance, but actually it's more complicated than that. So a lack of balance is persistent overwork and an inability to switch off. And when we talk about overwork, it is that persistence. I think we all understand that now and again we might be asked to do a little bit more during peaks and troughs to get a particular job done. And if we want to ask for flexibility from our employers now and again, then most of us are really happy to maintain that balance. But it's when it becomes persistent. And an example would be that you don't ever take a lunch break. And there are lots and lots of people who don't even leave their desks at lunch. But you have not taken a lunch break for so long that now one day you want to take a lunch break and you feel guilt about taking that lunch break because it's just not what you do and you feel you'll be thought of badly. That's the sort of persistent overwork and inability to switch off that really is becoming a problem. Then there is the neglect of other areas of life. Are we starting to neglect our family, our friends, our passions, the things that we've always loved? Do we start to get relationship problems? And where we do, and that's because of work, there is a problem. You can start to get illnesses. And very often that might just be because your immune system is low because you're never getting that chance to recover. Or it might be manifesting itself in musculoskeletal issues because we're carrying all that tension in our bodies. And if we have all of this, then we start to get to the burnout. And I want to be really clear that burnout and stress are not the same thing. Stress is where you are highly engaged and really trying really, really hard to get absolutely everything done. Burnout is where you have done that for so long or so intensively that you actually start to become exhausted. You are disengaged. You're lacking in self-care. All the positive things you used to do to support yourself are things that you move away from. You move away from friends and families. So stress is that I'm fully in it and it's tough. And burnout is actually, there's a 12-step process to reaching full burnout. But it is very much symbolized by these sorts of characteristics. And when you get to the 12th point of burnout, you're in full physical and mental breakdown. So as you look at that list, more reflection for you. I want you to ask yourself, how many of these areas can you say, yes, that is me? Because if there are several of these, now is the time to take action. When you get further down that 12-point scale of burnout, you will not have the ability to take action because you will be so disengaged and so worn out. So you need to do it much earlier on when you start to spot these signs and symptoms. And another thing is that you might always be feeling that you should be doing something else. When you're at work, you feel that you wish you were at home. When you're at home, you wish that you were at work, and so on and so forth. And perhaps that's literally all you've got time for. You haven't got time for those other things, the passions that you care about. So I'm going to give you some bad news now. Sorry. Disappointment is the gap that exists between expectation and reality. And if you think about your life, I think this applies for most people most of the time. So whether it's that wedding that you're looking forward to or the holiday that you've built yourself up to for a year and a half, the really high expectations are what lead to the disappointment, because nothing can live up to the expectation that you had. So I always joke when I start my in-person training with people, I ask them, have they any expectations? Invariably, it's the start of the day and everybody says, no expectations. And I say, that's great. Really low expectations is always really good for me, because I can only exceed their expectations if they're really low. And it's a bit like that with our work-life balance as well. And particularly because we live in this world of social media, where we are constantly confronted with Stacey Solomon showing us her beautiful, clean home, that everything is cream, including the clothes that the children are wearing, and everybody's immaculate. And that she's doing this high-powered job and wonderful house and all those things. And that's distilled down from 24 hours to a 10-minute video clip, and we're all comparing ourselves to it. Now, Stacey Solomon may not be your bag, but you get the picture. It could be a Kardashian, it could be anybody. And all of a sudden, we are people who were born to live in tribes. We were living in a tribe of maybe 30 people. Instinctively, that's still what we're hardwired for. We compared ourselves to maybe 30 people a day, and our world was that big. So our expectations actually were pretty low, because everybody was in the same boat as us. And now we've got access to this entire world of what might be unrealistic expectations. Maybe the job that you're doing, you're only doing because you want to afford the things that those other people afford. But actually, if you stopped for a minute and thought about what matters to you, it might not be that stuff that matters to you. There might be a different way to approach it. And I fear that I have to say the same about this training, because I am not going to solve every problem you've got with work-life balance today. Hopefully, what I will do is give you a framework within which to work, to explore your beliefs about work-life balance, your behaviours, your attitudes, whether you can make some changes, the evidence which says what works and what doesn't, and then build something step by step that you can get more towards the work-life balance that you want. But we are always looking for progress over perfection, because again, if we look for perfection in work-life balance, we aren't really ever going to get there. And I also want to be really honest that there are some people for whom achieving a work-life balance is harder. And those people are women. You know, and if there are any men in the room, this is not a have a dig at a man day, but the evidence tells us that primary carers tend to be women, and those primary carers might be the primary carer of the children, it might be the primary carer of older relatives or even adult children. Families come in all shapes and sizes, and lots of people need care at certain times in their life, and it will often be a woman in the family that ends up carrying that. But also it is the woman that carries the mental load for the vast majority of the time. It is the woman who is constantly managing who's at what club, what day, what time, have they got the kit to go with that, have I remembered to change the childcare, and so on and so on. And the evidence is pretty clear that that is pretty consistent, not exclusively, but pretty consistent across the gender gap. And that men, that's not to say men aren't doing their bit, but men tend to, in these situations, be somebody who carries out an instruction given to them by the primary carer, rather than somebody who is doing the thinking. So the primary mental load, generally speaking, will rest with a woman. Lower socioeconomic groups tend to have less control over their work environment. And if they're doing things like, for example, cleaning jobs, and a woman is doing a cleaning job for a busy working woman, we think, well, hasn't that busy working woman got it all brilliant because she's now got a cleaner which frees her up? But often those women are freeing that time up to do more work rather than being able to use that as leisure time. So lower socioeconomic groups will struggle. They will have less choices. People in insecure work like temping, migrants, people on 0-hour contracts. And there is also something called the flexibility paradox. And the flexibility paradox is that when people have flexibility given to them, and again, we definitely saw this in the pandemic, and it still continues now for people who have more flexible working. The paradox is that people given that flexibility end up working harder and longer, largely due to insecurity over their work environment. So they end up doing more to try and protect themselves from losing the flexibility. But one positive thing I would ask you to think about is that if we're even talking about work-life balance, then I would consider that we're probably at an advantage, because for some of you, work-life balance was probably something that your parents never spoke about. For me, my parents never spoke about it because they didn't have the luxury. My dad went out to work all day in a hard manual labour job. He came home and he took over the childcare, and my mum went off to work for the night. And then we've still got people, again, often it will be migrants or people who are in the lower socioeconomic groups doing exactly that. And so work-life balance is a bit of a luxury, really, for those of us who have it, because it means that we have an expectation that we might be able to get work-life balance. Whereas for lots of people, they're so busy trying to make ends meet, it never even occurs to them, which is why I say work-life balance. You know, if we really think about it, maybe it is something that we could be pleased that we have the luxury of thinking about and talking about. And sorry, just to go back to that slide as well, if you feel that these things apply to you, it's again even more important to think about what you can do to support yourself. And we will come to those strategies and things that you can do in a minute. And then there is an author, Dr. Roxanne Gervais, and she says it's important to remember that work-life balance starts with the individual, not the organisation and not the family. Now, I put that quote in there not because I'm saying if you're not having a good work-life balance, it's your fault. That's not my suggestion at all. What I'm trying to say with that slide is to point out that if you're not happy with your work-life balance, it's not going to change without you doing something. You will have to be the person that instigates the change. You may be relying on other people to do their part too, but it starts with you. It starts with you to be the one to be brave enough to have a go and see what you can do to make it better. And now I'm going to ask you to do a little activity. And this is quite a big ask because it's a lot, and you're going to do it quick and dirty. So I want you to think about what are the most important things you want to achieve or focus on in your life in the next 6 months, in the next 2 to 5 years, and in the next 10 years. And I'm just going to stay quiet for a minute and you jot down really quickly what your immediate thoughts are. This is what you want, not what you think you have to settle for. Okay. If you didn't get as far as the medium term or the long term, don't worry, come back to it. But at least you will have had to think, hopefully, about the first 6 months. And some of you might be sitting there absolutely shell-shocked, because when I have delivered this slide before and I ask people, when did you last consider these questions? The answer is invariably, I have never considered these questions. But it's really important to consider these things, because otherwise, when you do this activity and you stand back, you might find that what you're working for isn't even what you want. And in 20 years' time, you will wake up and think, I've spent 20 years doing that because it's what everybody expected of me. And it's what everybody did. Everybody got a mortgage. Everybody got a house. Everybody did home improvements and they got a better car and they climbed the greasy pole. And actually, none of that ever mattered to me. So it is never too soon to ask yourself these questions. Now, if what you want to be is an astronaut, it might be a big ask. But I think most people, when they're thinking about work-life balance, what they want is pretty modest, actually. You know, if you give them the golden envelope, the golden ticket, and that says you can have anything, then yes, of course, we'll list off all the things that really, really are, eye-wateringly expensive and so on. But for most people, if you say to them, I want you to project forward 20 years and I want you to think about what will have been important to you in 20 years' time, it's not that complicated. It's really not that complicated. So do come back to this exercise and think about it again, and think about it often, because this isn't static. Suddenly you'll have an experience in your life and everything that you thought you wanted changes. So this is a process of continual review, and it's serious stuff if you want to live your life instead of somebody else's. And I just love this quote from Melinda Gates. If you don't set your agenda, somebody else will. And that somebody else might be a partner or a parent or a child or a boss or a friend. But who wants to live their life? And why would you live your life in a way that suits them instead of in a way that suits you? And I know that when you have huge amounts of commitments, there are sometimes occasions when you think, well, actually, I don't have the choice. There are responsibilities I have to meet. I do fully understand that. And I don't diminish the necessity of that and the pressure of that. But there might be some areas that you can at least tinker with. And you can start to do that by using your life wheel. And some of you might have seen this in one way or another in the past. So imagine this empty circle, which has got 8 segments in it, represents your life. And you would label each segment with things that are really important to you. So for me, it would be things like family, work, friends, health, personal development, leisure time, fitness, travel. They would be the sorts of things that would be really important to me in my life. So each of those things would represent a segment. And then I would score each of those things on a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of how satisfied I am with them at the moment. And that would give me an idea of how balanced my life is. Now, it might not be that you can be 10 on everything, and maybe you don't need to be. But if we look at one of these completed, this is an example from somebody else. So we can say that this person, family, has an importance level of 10. So they've coloured right to the outside. Whereas career is an 8, so they've coloured to here. So they're doing pretty well on how they feel, how satisfied they feel about their family and their career, but less so on how they're doing with their friends. Maybe they're being a bit neglected. And a good way to think about how this works is to think, right, if this is a wheel, how bumpy would my ride be if this wheel were on my wagon as I went on a journey? And ideally, what you want to get to is a place where this is as balanced as possible. So again, in your own time after the session, sit down and think really carefully, what are the 8 or so facets of my life that really matter to me, and how satisfied am I with them? And where you're really satisfied, you know you don't need to pay a great deal of attention. But where you know you're not very satisfied, then you can pay more attention. And I think this is an interesting example, actually, because if we look at this person, this person is family, they're 10 out of 10. That's great. They're really satisfied. But money is a 7, so they're less satisfied. Now, it might be that that person goes away and in context, they look at all this and say, actually, I say I'm a 7, but I don't want to compromise on the 10 I've got for family to get my 7 up to an 8 or a 9. So it's a good way to reevaluate and just check that everything is as good or as bad as we think it is. So to achieve balance in your life, ask yourself these questions. And I want you to be thinking of these questions in relation to you. You're the only person who matters today. To achieve balance, are you currently acting with intention? And what I mean by acting with intention is, if the things that you thought were important that you wanted to achieve in 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, if those things are not being achieved by what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, why are you doing them? Now, sometimes it's necessity. Okay, well, I have to do this job because I have to earn enough money to do those things. Fine. But sometimes we are wasting so much of our time by not acting with intention because we have never recognized that there is the goal we want to achieve over here. But in order to get to that goal, we actually have to do certain actions to take us there. We need an action plan, because without an action plan, that goal is a dream, and it's a dream you will probably never, ever manage to achieve. So act with intention. And I am not casting any aspersions or assuming anything. But if you spend a big chunk of your day looking at your phone I'm guessing that nowhere in your goals was be an expert on how to use the latest craze on my phone. And I know for a fact this is what people do. They pick up their phone to look at whatever the important thing is, the WhatsApp message. It could be the kids. We must look at that. But then we have gone into autopilot with our phones. And so then we've got to nip over and take a look at the emails. And then we've got to nip over to Facebook. Well, while I'm here, I might as well look at Instagram. And then what about LinkedIn? And I can see some of the smiling faces. So I know this is how we all work. This is not me saying I've cracked it and you haven't. This is just saying this is how we're programmed. And on your phones, you've got technology that helps you to look at how much are you doing that? How much of your time are you wasting online doing things that don't matter? So ask yourself, could you act with more intention? And if you did, would you be able to achieve more of what is important to you? And that can be enormously liberating when it comes to achieving a work-life balance. Are you living by your values? Do you know what matters to you? And are you living by that? It's a kind of extreme example, but if you were a vegan working in an abattoir, it wouldn't be a great fit. And you're unlikely to ever feel that you're getting work-life balance if you're doing something completely at odds with who you are as a human being. Are you creating and applying boundaries? Are you prioritizing yourself importantly? You cannot pour from an empty vessel. Are you placing unnecessary limitations on yourself? Do you think, I can't do that? That's not for people like me, because that's just self-talk. That's not truth. And we've talked about in some of the other sessions, thoughts are not facts. Only facts are facts. So don't think yourself into things not being appropriate for you. And do you appreciate that work and money aren't the only things that have value? Family has value. Time has value. These things that are valuable to you really matter. But if we don't do those things because we think, well, we've got to earn the extra £5 or whatever it is, then we remove ourselves from the ability to live the life, the balance we want. So come back to this and think about, am I giving myself the best chance by living by these kinds of standards? Are you managing your time well? If not, there are resources online. Look up time management strategies. Are you using the support that's available to you? Or when offered help, do you always say no? Do you have that strand in you that says, I should be able to manage on my own? And yet you would be devastated if somebody you knew didn't accept your help when they needed it. But there is that pride in you that stops you taking support from other people. Are you influenced consciously or subconsciously, drawn to or rejecting the model of work life that you were raised around? Because most of us are. Sometimes it's conscious, that we choose a way because it's what we were raised with, or because it's exactly not what we were raised with. And sometimes it's subconscious. But ask yourself, is this my idea of work-life balance, or is this something that I've drawn on from my family? And be aware of your relationships, whether they are drains or radiators. Are the people in your life putting unreasonable demands on you? Or are they things that they necessarily need help with? Do they reciprocate? If you offer help and support other people, do they reciprocate? Are they respectful of your hopes and dreams as well as thinking about their own? Because some relationships, there is a saying that relationships are here for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. And sometimes we hold on to relationships that don't serve us particularly well anymore because we've just always done it. And maybe sometimes we need to look after ourselves a bit better than that. And I do not apologize. I use this slide all the time. So if you've seen one of my other sessions, you may have seen it. And I use it all the time because it's so true and it's so important. Ask yourself, these are Stephen Covey's circles, and the inner circle is your circle of control. That is where you have complete power. And the only thing you have complete power over is yourself. My decisions, what I do, my behaviors. Outside that, you've got your circle of influence. You can influence your boss, your friends, your family, but you can't control them. So you have a little less control when we get to the circle of influence. And our circle of concern is the stuff we can do nothing about. So when you look at your work-life balance, concentrate clearly and heavily on what you can control. Your actions, your reactions, and then plan around that and who you can influence. But forget the stuff that is just in your circle of concern that you can do nothing about, because it's a waste of your time and your energy. It's a real whistle-stop tour of that particular model, but it's a really, I think, out of everything I ever talk about, this is one of the most powerful things, is recognizing where you're wasting time and energy worrying about things you can do nothing about. So the question now is, we have started to look at things that might be a help or a hindrance. Will you now, if work-life balance is an issue for you, decide where your priorities really lie? Really think about those things. Where do your priorities really lie, not somebody else's? Can you compromise on some things to get you closer to where you want to be? And can you resist conforming to what everybody else seems to think is important? Everybody else thinks it's important to buy a house and have it paid off by the time you're 55. And does that matter to you? If not, live a different life. If you've always wanted to run your own business, but you didn't because you had a mortgage to pay, could you buy a smaller house? Could you rent? There are so many different ways to live the life you want to love. And roll with the peaks and troughs. Know, understand and accept that there will always be times when you are busier than you would like to be. But as long as they are a peak and a trough and it's not continuous, that consistent overwork, hopefully it will be more manageable. And I know we've got a largely female-based audience. There was an interesting study done over about 80 odd years. And at the end of the study, they asked the participants so these people were coming to the end of their life. They asked the participants, what do you wish you'd done differently? And you could break the answers down into two broad categories. Most men said they wished they'd spent more time with their families. But because this was done over 80 years, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this was done during a period where it was predominantly the man was the breadwinner and out earning the money. And the women in this very long study, they said, I wish I'd cared less about what other people thought of me. And so when we look at that bullet point that says recognize you can't please all of the people, one of the saddest things I see all the time is people who are spending so much time trying to please everybody else that they rarely ever get to the point where they please themselves. And maybe it is time to start to put yourself first now and again. And maybe we should consider that having it all may be a myth. If our idea of having it all is a bit skewed. But satisfaction isn't a myth. We can still get to satisfaction. Because what we know about studies of happiness is that periods of euphoria followed by the kind of down afterwards, because what goes up must come down. Those periods of euphoria are fantastic. But the people who have real long-term happiness in life are not people striving for euphoria. They're people striving for contentment. So if you can have a lower level, more balanced idea of what it is that a happy, well-balanced life looks like, you know, if you can be satisfied sitting on the sofa watching Strictly on a Saturday night instead of being out at an expensive restaurant, you're far more likely to be satisfied with your life. And again, that's stuff that has come out of the research that has been done. And we've got a little friend here, and this is my very poor attempt to illustrate reflection, because they are reflecting on themselves. The work that has been done that looks carefully at the small minority of people who achieve work-life balance over a long period of time has established, and this was a gender balanced study, what they found was that those who are able to resist the long hours culture have a process that they go through in order to be able to resist it. The first thing they do is they pause, they reflect, and they denormalize the situation that they're in. So they do not assume that the situation they're in is just how it should be. Instead, they start to think about, what am I sacrificing? What's getting lost? Am I prioritizing correctly? And then they create an idea of what a new normal is. And from there, they pay attention to the emotions that come with not satisfying that need. And I've mentioned it on other courses. There is a great book called Permission to Feel. It has come back to me. Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett. And he helps you understand what you're feeling, because we're terrible at knowing what we're feeling, because we've been encouraged, or don't cry, or don't get upset, or don't get angry all our lives. That's all we've been told. So we turn off the emotions and we switch off from feeling them. So we need to get back in touch with what we're really feeling to know what's really going on with us. And once we've done that, we are then in a position to reprioritize as necessary. Is this job and the hours that it gives me what I really want? Or actually, do I want more of that? And I'd rather pay somebody to do the childcare or the elder care or whatever it might be to free me up to do that thing that's important to me. Consider that there are alternative options. If the job you're in disappeared tomorrow, you would find an alternative, but you don't have to wait for that to happen in order to consider the alternatives. And then the really brave thing, the really courageous thing, is that you implement the changes. And those changes need to be both public and private. So publicly, you need to declare to people this is changing, whether that is to your employer, where it'll be more of a, could we change this? Or whether it's to your family about, could we have a bit more support here? And these are the things that were consistently evidenced in people who achieved work-life balance. They stopped working on autopilot, they paused, they reflected, they denormalized, and then they created their own better version of what they wanted. And the author of that study, 2 authors, they said these 5 steps outlined above are not a one-time activity, but rather a cycle of continuous reevaluation and improvement. And that is the same across everything that occurs within well-being, within happiness, within work-life balance. It is never a one and done. You don't get there. You don't have an arrival point because life is always changing. So instead of that, what you're working to do is think about what might I need to change. It might be every 6 months, every year, or at a peak time where something happens that just makes you think, now's the time to think about it. And then there are the employers, because all of this so far has been focused on you. And the reason it's been focused on you is because if you remember those circles from Stephen Covey, the only thing you can control is that inner circle, which is you. That's not to say everything is your responsibility and you have to do everything, but you've got to identify what you can control and what you can influence before you set your plan of action about what you're going to do to improve the work-life balance. And a good employer would ask what you need. They would provide psychologically safe environments, by which I mean they'll provide an environment when things aren't going well, you can speak up. Psychologically safe environments are places where people can make a mistake, where people can speak up if they're struggling, and they will be supported, not chastised. And that is hugely, hugely important in the current working environment. They can train leaders to identify emerging issues with their staff, because not all staff will speak up, even if the format is there for them. They will need some encouragement, and leaders should be able to see that. Employers will embrace flexible working. None of this nonsense about, oh, well, I can't do it for you because then I'll have to do it for everybody. No, that's not true. Flexible working is flexible to individuals and their needs. They will encourage you to have balance and to have breaks. They will review and adapt workloads to make sure that people aren't overwhelmed. And they would very much reject that always-on culture that you would be expected to answer emails outside work, take calls outside work hours, have those wretched WhatsApps binging and bonging all night long when you have nothing to do with the conversation that's going on. They would have realistic turnaround times for things. And they would offer supportive activities like training like this. So if your employer is involved in the Healthy Workplace Scheme, that's an indication they want to do the right thing. So you need to be clear on your work boundaries. This is like the real starting point. What are your start, finish and break times? Be clear. Do you accept outside work hours contact? And if you do, whose responsibility is that? Is that your responsibility or is it your employer's responsibility? And how do you start to get under that and tackle it? Does anyone have unrealistic expectations of you, either your employer or your family? And if so, let them know they're not realistic. Ask yourself, are the issues that you're experiencing cultural? In other words, the organisation you're in seems to expect this of me, or are they self-imposed? Because for a lot of us, overwork is something we do because we feel important. There is a culture of busy. And if we are able, how many people do you say, how are you? And the first thing they'll say is stressed and busy, because we feel more important when we're busy. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody that's here is doing that, but you will be experiencing it around you all the time. And then you feel, well, if I'm not saying I'm busy, maybe I'm not doing enough. So just ask yourself, where is this coming from? Are you creating and maintaining precedents that are self-imposed rather than imposed by other people? Are you experiencing digital overload, and do you tolerate toxic behaviours? And if any of these things are going on for you, again, this is not saying this is your fault. It's just trying to highlight to you a framework within which you can identify where the issues really are and then develop the action plan. There is a summary of top supportive elements, things that we've pretty much talked about already. Good boundaries, good planning, good time management. Taking small breaks is really important. Even if every 24 minutes you just take, or every 25 minutes you take a 5-minute break, that's enough. It could be shorter than that. It could be a 2-minute break. The evidence is very clear that we need to do that. Longer breaks, take your annual leave. Engage with other people is so important. Find meaning in your work. Speak to your manager if there's a problem. Have a passion, something you love that you reconnect with, that reminds you who you really are at your core. Get that support from work. A lot of employers have employee assistance programs. You forget about them because you don't need them when you hear about them. And then when you do need them, you've forgotten they existed. Additional support, whether that's a GP or a counsellor, and prioritise your well-being for yourself. And then just as we come to the final few slides, when you're really struggling and things seem really tough and you feel like you're meeting the demands of everybody else, sometimes reframing things can be extremely valuable. So whether it is looking after an older relative or a young child, we often use the terminology, I have to do this, I have to do that. And a really positive reframe of that is, I get to do this for them. And I get to do that for them. Because if they weren't there tomorrow, and I know this is pretty deep, but for most of us, those things we complain about having to do for others, if we didn't have that person to do it for tomorrow, we'd give anything to be able to get to do it for them again. And remember, you always have choice. You might not like the choices, but you still have them. And not making a choice is still a choice. So make the choices that are right for you. It doesn't have to be an overnight lightning bolt. It can be small steps to take you more towards the work-life balance that you want. Michelle will share these slides, and there is some stuff on there, some resources that might help you. Citizens' advice about rights at work, HSE about how employers should be dealing with you, and then some other suggestions on there as well. They are my contact details. And as I finish up to take questions, I just want to say that nothing changes if you don't. That is not to say it's all your responsibility, but you are the catalyst. If you keep doing what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you've always got. If you identify and reflect about where the changes need to happen, you can make a difference. And if the people that are around you aren't helping you make that difference, maybe they're not the people, employers, friends that you need to be around. So thank you so much for your fantastic attention. We are now going to have 5 minutes of questions, and actually I'm always happy to run over the 5 minutes if anybody's got any more questions. So I think Michelle